Margaret Chen stood in her front yard, holding a $500 fine from the Willowbrook HOA, her hands trembling with rage. Around her, what they called weeds, buzzed with life-native bees dancing between wildflowers, monarch butterflies, laying eggs, on milkweed, and a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. The HOA president had given her 30 days to restore proper landscaping or face escalating penalties. But Margaret had spent 15 years as a wildlife biologist, and she knew something they didn't. The city had just passed an ordinance protecting certified wildlife habitats from any interference, including HOA regulations. As she watched her neighbor's sprinkler system poison the ground with chemicals while her garden teemed with endangered species, Margaret smiled, for the morning sun cast long shadows across Margaret Chun's front yard as she knelt beside a cluster of purple coneflowers, her weathered hands gently removing invasive bindweed that had crept in overnight. At 52, she moved with the careful precision of someone who understood that every action in nature had consequences. The native plants around Erblicide Susans, wild bergamot, and prairie dropseed grass waved in the early breeze, their roots running deep into soil that hadn't seen chemicals in over 3 years. A cardinal landed on the nearby oak snag she'd deliberately left standing, its red plumage brilliant against the weathered bark. Margaret paused in her work, watching as the bird cocked its head, listening for insects in the dead wood. Most people would have had that snag removed years ago, calling it an eyesore. But Margaret knew it housed at least 6 species of native bees and provided nesting sites for woodpeckers. There she is again, the voice carried across the street, sharp with disdain. Margaret didn't need to look to know it was Diane Westbrook, the HOA president, standing on her immaculate lawn with its chemically green grass and perfectly spaced impatiens, but she looked anyway, meeting the woman's cold stare with steady eyes. Diane wore her usual armor, a pressed white blouse, khaki, slacks, and the expression of someone who'd never been told no in her life. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she held a leather portfolio that Margaret had learned to associate with trouble. "Morning, Diane," Margaret said, rising to her feet and brushing dirt from her knees. Her jeans were old and comfortable, stained with honest work. "Beautiful day, isn't it? We need to talk." Diane's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. She strode across the street, her heels clicking against the asphalt. The portfolio clutched against her chest like a shield. Margaret waited, her hands still dirty from the soil. Behind her, a monarch butterfly landed on a patch of milkweed, its orange wings catching the morning light. Considering their population had declined by 80% over the past 2 decades, "This has gone too far," Diane announced, stopping at the edge of Margaret's property. She made a sweeping gesture toward the native plants. "The board has been patient, but our patience has limits." "Patient with what, exactly?" Margaret kept her voice level, though her jaw tightened. They'd had this conversation before, but something in Diane's tone suggested today would be different. "Don't play innocent with me, Margaret. You know exactly what I'm talking about." Diane opened her portfolio and pulled out a thick document. The Willowbrook Community Association Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. Section 4.7 clearly states that all front yard landscaping must consist of appropriate turf grass and approved ornamental plants. "What you have here," she gestured dismissively. Margaret felt heat rise in her chest. "Those weeds are native prairie plants. They're what grew here before this subdivision was built on top of their habitat. They support local wildlife, require no irrigation, and prevent soil erosion." "Don't care if they cure cancer," Diane snapped. "They're not on the approved plant list, and they're bringing down property values. Mrs. Patterson has already complained that your ... project is affecting her ability to sell her house. Vivian Patterson has been trying to sell that house for 8 months because she's asking $40,000 over market value." Margaret shot back. "My garden has nothing to do with it. The board disagrees." Diane's smile was cold and satisfied, "which is why we're serving you with this formal notice." She held out an official-looking document. Margaret took it, her eyes scanning the legal language. The words seemed to blur together, but the meaning was clear. She had 30 days to remove all non-compliant vegetation and install appropriate landscaping or face escalating fines and potential legal action. $500. Margaret read aloud, her voice tight with controlled anger. For the first violation, with additional penalties of $250 per week until compliance is achieved, Diane added. Plus attorney fees and court costs if we have to take legal action. Margaret looked up from the document, her dark eyes flashing. You can't be serious. I'm absolutely serious. The board voted unanimously last night. This is your first and final notice. Around them, the morning was coming alive. A ruby hummingbird darted between the bee-balm flowers, its wings a blur of motion. A pair of goldfinches chattered in the oak tree, their yellow bodies bright against the green leaves. A red admiral butterfly spiraled down to land on the butterfly weed, joining the monarch that still fed there. Margaret had spent 3 years carefully cultivating this ecosystem. She'd studied the native plant communities that had once thrived in this part of Illinois, researched seed sources, and slowly transformed her sterile lawn into a haven for local wildlife. Every plant had been chosen for its ecological value, its ability to support native insects, birds, and small mammals. These plants are endangered, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Some of them are on the state's threatened species list. The wild lupin supports the Carner blue butterfly there. Are only a few hundred left in Illinois. That's not my concern, Diane replied. My concern is maintaining the standards that make Willowbrook a desirable place to live. Standards that everyone agreed to when they bought their homes. I never agreed to destroy native habitat. You agreed to follow the HOA covenants. It's all in the paperwork you signed. Diane's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd won the argument before it began. 30 days, Margaret. After that, we'll be forced to take action. She turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Margaret, I'd recommend you start calling landscaping companies. The approved plant list is attached to the notice. I'm sure you'll find something suitable. Margaret watched her walk away, the legal document heavy in her hands. Her neighbors were beginning to emerge for their morning routines. Jim Foster, retrieving his newspaper, Sandra Collins loading her kids into the minivan, old Pete Kowalski shuffling out to check his mail. Most of them averted their eyes, unwilling to get involved in what they saw as a property dispute. But this wasn't about property. This was about something much larger. Margaret had spent 15 years working as a wildlife biologist for the Illinois Department of Natural Resources before taking early retirement. She'd seen the slow-motion disaster unfolding across the state native prairies plowed under for corn, wetlands drained for development, forests fragmented by roads and subdivisions. Every year, the reports grew more dire. Bird populations declining, insect numbers crashing, plant species disappearing. She'd moved to Willowbrook 3 years ago, drawn by the promise of a quiet retirement in a well-maintained community. But the sterile lawns and exotic landscaping had troubled her from the beginning. Here was a place where native plants could thrive, where small pockets of habitat could be restored, where children could learn about the natural world that had existed before concrete and Kentucky bluegrass. The garden had started smaller, few native plants in the backyard, barely visible from the street. But as the ecosystem developed, as the wildlife began to return, Margaret had become more ambitious. She'd gradually expanded into the front yard, replacing sections of lawn with native plants. The transformation had been remarkable. Species she hadn't seen in suburban areas for decades had begun appearing in her garden. But now, Diane Westbrook and her board of suburban generals wanted to destroy it all. Margaret folded the legal document and walked back toward her house, a modest ranch-style home with cedar siding and large windows that overlooked the garden. She'd bought it after her divorce. Using half the proceeds from the sale of the house she'd shared with David for 22 years, it was meant to be her sanctuary, her place of peace after decades of fighting bureaucratic battles over endangered species and habitat protection. Instead, she'd found herself in another fight. The screen door creaked as she entered the kitchen, a bright space with white cabinets and windows that looked out over the backyard prairie. She made coffee with hands that shook slightly from anger, then sat at the kitchen table to read the legal notice more carefully. The language was dense and intimidating, full of legal terms and references to the original covenants. But the message was clear: conform or face the consequences. Margaret had seen similar documents before in her work with the state. The war room was Margaret's kitchen table, now covered with printed emails, wildlife photographs, plant identification guides, and legal documents. 21 days remained on the HOA's ultimatum, and Margaret had transformed her quiet morning routine into a military operation. She was up before dawn, documenting every species in her garden, photographing evidence of wildlife activity, and building the most comprehensive habitat assessment she'd ever compiled. The coffee maker gurgled as she reviewed Jim Morrison's latest email. The state's legal department had confirmed that her property met all technical requirements for certification, but they were concerned about the political implications. 5 other HOAs across Illinois had already contacted the Department of Natural Resources, threatening legal action if Margaret's certification was approved. "We're in uncharted territory," Jim had written. The program was designed to protect large rural properties, not to override suburban community standards. But the law is clear. Certified wildlife habitats are protected from local regulations that conflict with conservation goals. Margaret printed the email and added it to her growing pile of evidence. Outside, the October morning was crisp and clear, perfect weather for the garden tour she'd scheduled for this afternoon. If the HOA wanted to question whether her property qualified as legitimate wildlife habitat, she'd show them exactly what they were trying to destroy. The doorbell rang at 9:30. Margaret opened it to find a young woman with auburn hair and bright green eyes holding a professional camera and a notebook. "Dr. Chen, I'm Rebecca Martinez from the Illinois Audubon Society. Dr. Morrison asked me to conduct an independent wildlife assessment of your property." Margaret had worked with Rebecca before, during her time with the state. She was one of the most skilled field biologists in Illinois, with a particular expertise in urban ecology. Her assessment would carry significant weight with the certification board. "Thank you for coming," Margaret said, leading her toward the garden. "I know this is short notice. Are you kidding? This is exactly the kind of project I live for." Rebecca's eyes were already scanning the native plants, her trained gaze cataloging species and relationships. "Jim told me you've documented over 40 native plant species in a suburban front yard. I had to see it to believe it." They spent the next 3 hours systematically documenting the garden's biodiversity. Rebecca moved with the focused intensity of a scientist gathering evidence, photographing plants, recording GPS coordinates, and making detailed notes about wildlife interactions. Margaret watched her work, remembering her own early days as a field biologist, the thrill of discovery that came with finding unexpected life in unlikely places. "Incredible," Rebecca murmured, kneeling beside a patch of wild ginger. "You've got trout lily here, and bloodroot, and is that wild leek?" "A small population," Margaret confirmed. "They appeared on their own after I established the woodland edge habitat." "This is old-growth forest understory community," Rebecca said, her voice filled with professional excitement. "These species don't just volunteer in suburban yards. They require specific soil conditions, mycorrhizal relationships, seed dispersal patterns. You've essentially recreated a pre-settlement ecosystem." As they worked, neighbors began to notice the activity. Jim Foster stopped his leaf blowing to watch them photograph butterflies. Sandra Collins slowed her morning jog to stare at the 2 women crouched in the native grasses. Even old Pete Kowalski shuffled over to ask what they were doing. "Scientific research," Margaret explained. "We're documenting the wildlife that uses native plants for habitat." Pete squinted at the garden, his weathered face skeptical. "Looks like weeds to me." "That's what most people think," Rebecca said, not looking up from her camera. "But these weeds support more biodiversity than the rest of the neighborhood combined. That little patch of prairie dropseed is home to at least 6 species of native moths. The oak tree supports over 500 species of insects and spiders. 500 Pete's eyebrows shot up in one tree. Native oaks are keystone species," Margaret explained. "They're the foundation of the food web. Those insects feed the birds disperse seeds, the plants provide habitat for more insects. It's all connected." Pete studied the garden with new eyes, then shook his head. "Still looks like weeds to me, but I guess you ladies know what you're talking about." After he left, Rebecca turned to Margaret with a grin. "That's the challenge, isn't it? Helping people see past their conditioning to recognize the value of native ecosystems?" "It's the story of my career," Margaret said, fighting to protect things that most people don't understand or value. They were interrupted by the sound of a car door slamming. Margaret looked up to see Diane Westbrook striding across the street, her face tight with anger. She was followed by a man in an expensive suit, tall, gray-haired, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to winning legal battles. "Mrs. Chen," Diane called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone making an official pronouncement. "I'd like you to meet Thomas Brennan, the HOA's legal counsel." Margaret straightened, her hands still dirty from the soil. Rebecca continued photographing, but Margaret could see her recording the confrontation with her phone. "Mr. Brennan," Margaret said, her voice carefully neutral, "what brings you to my garden? I'm here to discuss the legal implications of your current ... situation." Brennan's voice was smooth and professional, but Margaret caught the underlying threat. "I understand you're attempting to circumvent the HOA's authority through some kind of state program." "I'm applying for wildlife habitat certification," Margaret said. "My property meets all the requirements." "That remains to be seen," Brennan replied, "but I want to make sure you understand the full scope of what you're facing. The Willowbrook HOA has retained my firm to pursue all available legal remedies. If you continue with this course of action, you'll be facing not just HOA fines, but potential litigation for breach of contract, violation of community standards, and interference with property values." Margaret felt her anger rising, but kept her voice steady. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Brennan? I'm informing you of the legal realities. HOA covenants are legally binding contracts. You agreed to maintain your property according to community standards when you purchased your home. The state certification program doesn't override those contractual obligations." Rebecca looked up from her camera, her green eyes flashing. "Actually, it does. The Wildlife Habitat Protection Act of 2024 specifically states that certified habitats are protected from local regulations that conflict with conservation goals. It's designed to prevent exactly this kind of interference." Brennan's confident expression faltered slightly. "And you are?" "Dr. Rebecca Martinez, Illinois Audubon Society. I'm conducting an independent assessment of this property for the state certification program, I see." Brennan's tone became more cautious. "Well, the law you're referring to is untested. There are significant questions about its scope and applicability to suburban properties." "No, there aren't," Rebecca said firmly. "The law is quite clear. Certified wildlife habitats receive protection regardless of their location or size." Diane stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous. We're talking about a front yard, not some pristine wilderness. The whole purpose of community standards is to maintain property values and neighborhood aesthetics. The whole purpose of wildlife habitat is to support biodiversity and ecological function," Rebecca shot back, "which is exactly what this property does." Margaret watched the confrontation unfold, recognizing the fundamental clash of worldviews. To Diane and her supporters, the neighborhood was a collection of property investments that needed to be protected from anything that might reduce their value. To Rebecca and the conservation community, every patch of habitat was a crucial piece of the larger ecological puzzle. 18 days, Brennan said, addressing Margaret directly. "You have 18 days to comply with the HOA's requirements. After that, we'll be pursuing all available legal remedies." After they left, Margaret and Rebecca stood in the garden, the tension of the confrontation still hanging in the air. "They're scared," Rebecca said. "Did you see how Brennan backed down? When I mentioned the Wildlife Habitat Protection Act, he knows the law is on your side." "But he's right about one thing," Margaret said. "The law is untested. We don't know how courts will interpret it when it comes to suburban properties." "Then we better make sure your certification is rock solid," Rebecca said, "because this is going to be a test case that affects habitat restoration across the state." That afternoon, Margaret hosted the garden tour she'd been planning. Word had spread through the local naturalist community, and by 2 o'clock, her front yard was filled with biologists, botanists, and conservation advocates. Dr. Sarah Mitchell from the University of Illinois studied the prairie reconstruction. Members of the Native Plant Society photographed the rare woodland species. A group of master gardeners took notes on sustainable landscaping techniques, but it was the children who provided the most powerful testimony. Emma, the young girl who'd helped her count butterflies, had brought 3 of her friends. They moved Through the garden, with the wonder of natural explorers, pointing out caterpillars and beetles, asking questions about every plant and anima. Friday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth for late October, as if nature itself was celebrating. Margaret stood in her garden at dawn, watching a red-tailed hawk circle overhead while she waited for the call that would change everything. Her phone had been ringing constantly since Wednesday, reporters, lawyers, conservation groups, and HOA representatives all wanting statements about the impending certification. She'd turned off the ringer the night before, needing silence to prepare for what was coming. At exactly 9 o'clock, Jim Morrison called. "It's official," he said, his voice carrying both triumph and trepidation. "The Illinois Department of Natural Resources has certified your property as protected wildlife habitat under state conservation law. You should receive the official documentation within the hour." Margaret felt a surge of relief, so powerful it nearly buckled her knees. "Thank you, Jim. Thank you for everything. Don't thank me yet. The real fight starts now." Margaret understood. The certification was just the first move in what would be a much larger legal chess game. But for this moment, she allowed herself to savor the victory. Her garden was safe, legally protected under state law, immune to HOA interference, officially recognized as valuable wildlife habitat. The documentation arrived by courier at 10:15 a.m. Margaret signed for the thick envelope with hands that trembled slightly, then carried it into her kitchen to read in private. The certification was elegant in its simplicity of formal letter. On state letterhead, signed by the Director of Natural Resources and bearing the official seal of Illinois. The Illinois Department of Natural Resources hereby certifies that the property located at 847 Maple Street, Willowbrook, Illinois, meets all requirements for designation as protected wildlife habitat under the Wildlife Habitat Protection Act of 2024. This certification provides legal protection for the designated habitat area and supersedes any local regulations that conflict with conservation goals. Margaret read the words 3 times, then walked to her front window to look out at her garden. A monarch butterfly was laying eggs in the milkweed, ensuring that next year's generation would return to this protected sanctuary. For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt something approaching peace. At 10:32 a.m., a black sedan pulled up to the curb. Thomas Brennan, the HOA's lawyer, emerged from the passenger seat, followed by 2 men in expensive suits whom Margaret didn't recognize. They walked purposefully toward her front door, carrying briefcases and wearing the grim expressions of people preparing for war. Margaret opened the door before they could knock. "Mr. Brennan," she said coolly, "I assume you've heard the news." "Indeed we have," Brennan replied, his voice carefully controlled, "which is why we're here. Dr. Chen, I'd like you to meet David Sterling from Sterling Walsh and Associates, and Robert Chun, no relation, from the Illinois Association of Community Organizations. We're here to discuss the legal ramifications of your certification." Margaret stepped onto her front porch, closing the door behind her. She wouldn't invite these men into her home, wouldn't give them any advantage in what was clearly going to be a hostile encounter. "What legal ramifications?" she asked. "The certification is valid under state law." David Sterling stepped forward, a tall man with silver hair and the predatory bearing of a corporate litigator. "Dr. Chen, the certification you've received is based on a deeply flawed interpretation of state law. The Wildlife Habitat Protection Act was never intended to override private property rights or existing legal contracts." "That's your interpretation," Margaret replied. "The law is quite clear about protecting certified habitats from conflicting local regulations." "The law is ambiguous," Robert Chen interjected. He was younger than the others, with sharp features and the nervous energy of someone eager to prove himself. "It doesn't specifically mention HOA covenants, which are private contracts rather than public regulations." Margaret felt her anger rising, but kept her voice level. "Gentlemen, I think we're done here. My property is legally protected wildlife habitat. Any attempt to interfere with that protection would be a violation of state law." "Actually, Sterling," said, pulling a document from his briefcase, "we're here to serve you with this." Margaret took the papers, scanning the legal language with growing alarm. It was a temporary restraining order filed in federal court, claiming that the state certification violated the HOA's property rights and requesting an injunction against any changes to the existing covenant enforcement process. "You're suing the state of Illinois?" Margaret asked, incredulous. We're seeking clarification of the law through proper judicial channels, Sterling replied smoothly. The federal court has jurisdiction over constitutional questions regarding property rights and interstate commerce. Margaret looked at the restraining order more carefully. The plaintiffs included not just the Willowbrook, HOA, but the Illinois Association of Community Organizations and something called the National Property Rights Foundation. This wasn't just about her garden anymore, it was a coordinated legal assault on conservation law itself. The hearing is scheduled for next Wednesday, Brennan added. Until then, the restraining order maintains the status quo. You still have until Sunday to comply with the HOA's original ultimatum. After they left, Margaret sat on her front steps, reading through the legal documents with growing understanding of what she was facing. This wasn't a simple property dispute. It was a test case that would determine whether environmental protection law could withstand coordinated legal and political pressure from powerful interests. Her phone rang. Jim Morrison's voice was tight with concern. Margaret, I just heard about the restraining order. Our legal department is reviewing it now, but this complicates everything. How bad is it? Bad. They're claiming that state certification violates federal constitutional principles regarding property rights and contractual obligations. If they win, it could invalidate the entire Wildlife Habitat Protection Act. Margaret felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. So if I lose, every conservation law in the country becomes vulnerable to similar challenges. That's the stakes they've set. This isn't about your garden anymore, Margaret. It's about whether environmental protection has any legal foundation in America. That afternoon, Margaret's quiet neighborhood was transformed into a media circus. News vans lined the street, reporters set up cameras on the sidewalk, and neighbors gathered in small groups to watch the spectacle. Margaret had become a reluctant celebrity, the face of a national debate about conservation, property rights, and the future of environmental law. She was giving her fourth interview of the day when she noticed Emma watching from across the street. The young girl's face pressed against her grandmother's front window. Margaret excused herself from the CNN reporter and walked over to the house. Emma's grandmother, Mrs. Patterson, opened the door before Margaret could knock. She was a small woman with gray hair and kind eyes, though her expression was troubled. I'm sorry about all this commotion, Margaret said. I know it's disrupting the neighborhood. Oh, don't you worry about that, Mrs. Patterson replied. Emma's been watching the news coverage. She's very concerned about your butterfly garden. Emma appeared beside her grandmother, still wearing her school clothes. Dr. Chen, are they? Really going to make you cut down all your flowers? I don't know, Emma. Some people want me to, but I'm trying to stop them. But the butterflies need your flowers, Emma said, her voice small and worried. Where will they go if you have to cut them down? It was the same question that had driven Margaret's entire career. Where would wildlife go when their habitat disappeared? The answer, too often, was nowhere. They simply vanished, one species at a time, until entire ecosystems collapsed. That's why I'm fighting so hard to keep the garden, Margaret said. Because you're right, the butterflies do need these flowers. Mrs. Patterson invited Margaret inside for coffee, away from the reporters and cameras. The house was warm and comfortable, filled with the kind of accumulated memories that come from decades of family life. Emma showed Margaret her nature journal, filled with drawings of the butterflies and birds she'd observed in Margaret's garden. She's become quite the naturalist, Mrs. Patterson said with pride, all because of your garden. Before this, she barely noticed birds or insects. Now she sees them everywhere. Margaret looked through Emma's careful observations sketches of monarch butterflies. Notes about when different flowers bloomed, questions about migration and life cycles. It was exactly the kind of wonder and curiosity that conservation education was meant to inspire. Emma, Margaret said, would you like to help me with something important? The girl nodded eagerly. I need to document all the different animals. They used the garden. Would you help me make a list of everything you've seen there? They spent the next hour creating a comprehensive wildlife inventory. Emma's sharp eyes and careful memory adding species that Margaret had missed. By the time they finished, they'd documented over 90 different animals that depended on the garden for food, shelter, or breeding habitat. 90 species, Mrs. Patterson said, reading over their list, in a front yard. That's remarkable. It's what happens when you give nature a chance. The federal courthouse in Chicago loomed against the October sky like a monument to the weight of justice. Its limestone facade carved with the words, "Equal justice under law." Margaret walked up the broad steps, flanked by Alina and Rebecca. Emma's handmade bracelet warm against her wrist, while reporters shouted questions and camera flashes exploded around them. Behind them marched a quiet procession of supporter scientists, conservationists, and ordinary citizens who understood that this moment would define the future of environmental protection in America. Ahead, through the courthouse doors, waited the three-judge panel that would decide whether a suburban garden deserved the same legal protection as a national forest. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in adjacent rooms. Margaret took her seat at the plaintiff's table, trying to calm her racing heart as she surveyed the opposing forces arrayed against her. Defense table was crowded with lawyers from 3 different firms, representatives from the National Property Rights Foundation, and Thomas Brennan looking smugly confident. She was a small woman with silver hair and penetrating brown eyes, known for her methodical approach to complex legal questions and her intolerance for grandstanding. This case presents fundamental questions about the relationship between state environmental law and private property rights. Judge Williams began, and if so, whether the Illinois Wildlife Habitat Protection Act violates constitutional principles regarding property rights and contractual obligations. David Sterling rose to present the opening argument for the plaintiffs. His silver hair caught the courtroom lights as he approached the podium with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a case that mattered. "Your Honors," he began, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty, "this case strikes at the heart of American property rights. The defendant's actions, supported by a misguided state certification program, represent a direct assault on the fundamental principle that property owners have the right to enter into binding agreements about the use of their land." Sterling painted Margaret as a radical activist who had deliberately violated her contractual obligations, and then manipulated state environmental law to avoid the consequences. He argued that the Wildlife Habitat Protection Act was an unconstitutional taking of private property rights, a government overreach that threatened the foundation of suburban communities across America. If this court allows state environmental agencies to override private property agreements, Sterling continued, no homeowners association, no planned community. Property values will plummet, community standards will collapse, and the rule of law will be replaced by ecological activism. Margaret watched the judges' faces as Sterling spoke, trying to read their reactions. Sterling's property rights arguments with interest. Judge Sarah Martinez, the youngest member of the panel, was taking careful notes. When Sterling finished, Alina rose to present Margaret's case. She was a small figure at the podium, but her voice carried the passion of someone fighting for principles larger than herself. "Your Honors," Alina began, "this case is not about property rights versus environmental protection." Rather than arguing against property rights, she reframed the entire case around the public interest in conservation. She argued, just as they had determined, that civil rights, public safety, and environmental health deserved protection. Private agreements could not override laws designed to protect the common good. "The defendant's garden supports over 200 species of wildlife," Alina continued, "including several that are listed as threatened or endangered by the state of Illinois. These genetic resources, once lost, cannot be replaced. They represent millions of years of evolution, thousands of years of local adaptation." She showed photographs of the monarch butterflies, the native bees, the migrating birds that depended on this small patch of habitat for survival. "The plaintiff seeks to destroy this irreplaceable natural heritage," Alina said, "not because it harms anyone, not because it reduces property values, but simply because it doesn't conform to their aesthetic preferences. This court must decide whether private aesthetics can override public conservation law. The state of Illinois had the constitutional authority to protect wildlife habitat," he argued, "and federal courts should not interfere with valid state environmental law unless there was clear evidence of constitutional violation. Habitat Protection Act represents a legitimate exercise of state police power," Thompson argued. "States have always had the authority to regulate land use in the public interest, whether for public health, safety, or environmental protection. The fact that this regulation affects private property agreements does not make it unconstitutional. The arguments continued for 3 hours, with lawyers presenting legal precedents, constitutional theories, and competing visions of the relationship between property rights and environmental protection. But Margaret found herself thinking about simpler things, about Emma's nature journal, about the monarch butterflies preparing for their migration, about the red-tailed hawk that circled over her garden each morning. During a break, Margaret stepped outside the courthouse into the crisp October air. The crowd of supporters had grown throughout the day, and now included families with children, elderly couples holding hand-painted signs, and groups of young activists chanting environmental slogans. But it was the counter-protesters who caught her attention. They weren't the angry extremists she'd expected, but ordinary suburbanites, retirees worried about their property values, young families concerned about community standards, middle-aged homeowners who'd invested their life savings in houses whose value depended on neighborhood consistency. Dr. Chen. Margaret turned to see a woman in her 40s, approaching tentatively. She had tired eyes and wore a simple jacket over jeans. "I'm Susan Morrison," the woman said. "I live in Willowbrook, about 6 blocks from you." Margaret braced herself for another confrontation, but Susan's expression was troubled rather than hostile. "I wanted to tell you," Susan continued, "that my daughter Emily has been following your case. She's 8 years old, and she's been asking me questions I can't answer." "What kind of questions?" "About why people want to cut down the flowers that butterflies need. About whether it's more important to have pretty grass or to help animals. About what happens when there's nowhere left for wildlife to live." Susan looked away, then back at Margaret. "I signed the petition supporting the HOA. I was worried about property values, about maintaining community standards. But Emily's questions—" Margaret reached out and touched the woman's arm gently. "Those are important questions. Maybe the most important questions we can ask. I just wanted you to know," Susan said, "that not everyone in the neighborhood is against you. Some of us are starting to wonder if we've got our priorities wrong." When court resumed, Judge Williams announced that the panel would hear final arguments before making their decision. Sterling rose first, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone certain of victory. "Your Honors, the law is clear. Property rights are fundamental to American freedom, and contractual obligations must be enforced. The state cannot use environmental law as a pretext for violating private agreements and destroying community standards." Elena's closing argument was passionate but precise. "Your Honors, this case will determine whether environmental protection law has any meaning in America. If private contracts can override democratically enacted conservation law, then no environmental protection is safe. No endangered species habitat, no wetland preservation, no pollution control measure will survive legal challenge." She paused, looking directly at each judge in turn. "The question before this court is simple. Does nature have legal rights in America, or do private aesthetics trump ecological necessity?" Margaret sat in the courthouse hallway, surrounded by supporters, but feeling utterly alone. Everything she'd worked for, everything she believed in, was now in the hands of 3 federal judges who would decide not just her fate, but the future of conservation law. Rebecca sat beside her, offering quiet support. "Whatever happens, you've already won something important," she said.